Welcome to the Borders in Globalization podcast. Welcome to our listeners. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples in the Salish Sea region. As we know, borders are legal construct, conventional lines on maps made by states, landmarks on the ground, and a zone of control and violence. Today, we are going to talk about cross-border rights for Indigenous peoples and students with Michael O'Shea and Cameron Robertson. Michael is a researcher. He has just published a report about how Canadian universities honor the Jay Treaty through cross-border tuition policies. And Cameron Robertson is a Cree language writer. The report of Michael is translated in this language, this Cree language by Cameron. And we will learn about this process all during this interview. Michael and Cameron, great to see you, both of you. Welcome on board.
Great to be here.
So the interview today is divided into three parts. Firstly, some questions about Michael's research on the Jay Treaty. Secondly, Cameron will talk to us about the Cree language translation. And thirdly, a discussion about the cooperation between Michael and Cameron on this project. So let's start the first part. The Jay Treaty is the short name for the Treaty of Amity, Commerce and Navigation, a treaty negotiated in 1794 between the US and Great Britain. Michael, in relations with the borders and bordering processes, could you remind us, please, what is the Jay Treaty? What the Jay Treaty is about and its historical context?
Absolutely. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I am an Irish-American settler. I'm not Indigenous. Currently reside in what is sometimes called Cambridge, Massachusetts, the ancestral unceded territory of the Massachusetts people. And today is home to many Indigenous groups. It's been a great honor and privilege to be in relationship with Indigenous communities, learning about the Jay Treaty. My own Jay Treaty story began in 2014 when I visited a First Nations school in Winnipeg and met with the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba. At the time, I was working as an international student recruiter, and I was asked by teachers and students, how does the Jay Treaty relate to your work? I didn't know the answer to the question, but like a good researcher, I went back and began to learn and do some self-education. And now 10 years later, I'm still learning about the Jay Treaty. So I don't have all the answers, obviously, but I will share what I have learned, during this time in researching and talking to Indigenous advocates, lawyers, students, scholars, and so on. So to answer your question, Ben, the Jay Treaty dates back to 1794. So if you can imagine that the time period just after the American Revolution, so the 13 colonies are now an independent country. And despite the peace of the Treaty of Paris between Great Britain and the United States, there is rising tension or disagreement between the two countries. So there's the issue of British forts west of the colonies. Great Britain is impressing American sailors on their ships. There are a lot of other issues. So there's this fear that there's going to be an outbreak of war again between Great Britain and the United States. So George Washington dispatches John Jay to Great Britain. And over the next few months in London, he and his British counterparts hash out this treaty. And it does a lot. There are books and many articles written about the Jay Treaty. And I can't pretend to be a lawyer. But what it does in the short term is it avoids the outbreak of war between Great Britain and the US, at least until 1812, when there's another war. There's some political feelings in the US. There's actually a lot of public opposition to the Jay Treaty from European Americans They feel like that it sells out the United States to Great Britain. It gives too much to Great Britain. Or protests, some angry op-eds written against the Jay Treaty. But in any case, the Jay Treaty does pass. It's ratified by the U.S. Senate in 1795. So where this comes into our work and our discussion today is Article 3 of the Jay Treaty, which acknowledges the pre-existing right since time immemorial, right, for Indigenous peoples to cross whatever border that colonial powers put up. There was sort of an informal border after the Treaty of Paris. And this Article 3 recognizes this pre-existing right and states that an Indigenous person should be able to carry on commerce and move freely across this border. So that's our starting point in 1795. And we can go in a little deeper if you'd like, Ben, about what has happened since legally, and in terms of education too.
Perfect. Thank you for your answer, Michael, and for these historical clarifications. If we talk about today's context, Michael, what are the current issues of the Jay Treaty with respect to Indigenous people and students? What are their rights?
Sure. So I'll weigh in my experience as a settler researcher. There are folks with lived experiences navigating the border through their Jay Treaty rights. I want to honor that. So currently, the state of the law in Washington, D.C. is that the Jay Treaty is still a treaty in force, but with important caveats. Thanks through Indigenous advocacy and litigation and lawsuits, the Supreme Court ruled that the Jay Treaty still applies. There were, for example, Paul Dybo, the Mohawk iron worker. He successfully challenged his deportation from Philadelphia, by asserting his Jay Treaty rights. The U.S. government wanted to deport him back to the other side of the border, saying he needed a work permit to work in Philadelphia. In the 1920s, he said, no, through the Jay Treaty, I have the right to live, work, and study, if he wanted to study, in the U.S. In 1952, so we're going deep into laws and statutes here, this became statute law. So through immigration legislation through the U.S. Congress, this right has been affirmed to live, work, and study. The right to carry on commerce, I don't believe, has been affirmed. In addition, there is a blood quantum requirement, which we could unfortunately talk about all day. The problems and issues with blood quantum. I see Cameron nodding his head there. So to qualify for Jay Treaty rights, that is an Indigenous person from the other side of the border wishing to live, work, and study in what is sometimes called the United States, they would need to prove 50% Indigenous ancestry. There's some movement on this side of the border to remove that requirement in the law. Okay, so that's the state on this side of the border. On the other side of the border, Canada has never implemented the Jay Treaty. So there's nothing on the Canadian books that states that the Jay Treaty is in force. In fact, the Canadian Supreme Court has ruled the opposite, that the Jay Treaty was really an agreement between Great Britain and the U.S., never implemented in what is now Canada. So Canada is not bound by the Jay Treaty. So where my research comes in, and this is as an education researcher and someone interested in student success, what I'm interested in is that in just the last few years, a few universities on the Canadian side of the border have decided to acknowledge the Jay Treaty, decided to adopt the Jay Treaty for tuition purposes. So even as the Canadian government isn't taking action on the Jay Treaty, these universities have. And these universities can't, do a whole lot necessarily. They can't change immigration law. They can't give visas. They can't say that you're, exempt from visa rules. But what they can do in a narrow, but I think important way, many schools can waive international student tuition, right? So they can waive international student tuition. And in doing so, and they've publicly said so, they're doing so not only in the spirit of the Jay Treaty, but in the spirit of the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and in the spirit of UNDRIP, or the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I argue, and others would argue as well, that in doing so, they're recognizing the colonizing nature of the border, and recognizing that Indigenous homelands extend across the border, right? And so why would you, just because of a colonial border, why would you charge an Indigenous student that much more money for Indigenous student fees if they're living in an area that's been crossed by the border? And this could, present some opportunities for supporting Indigenous student success. We know from research that all students, including Indigenous students, benefit from financial aid. And I would say that this represents a form of financial aid by reducing the cost of attending post-secondary.
Okay, great, Michael. Thank you. I'm sure many young people and many young Indigenous students would be very interested in knowing better about the dispositions of this J Treaty. If we now speak more specifically of the rights to cross the border, could you tell us what are the facts and dynamics that you have observed in the area of tuition fees in the US and Canada? Could we speak about what some border scholars say about debordering process at the North American scale on this topic? What do you think?
Wow, that is a powerful and wide-ranging question, Ben. I'll try and bite off a chunk of that and try to answer it. So I've been interested in the number of students who have been able to access the policy. I think on one hand, there's a symbolic and political importance for schools to adopt the policy, but the educator in me, right, also wants to know, well, how many students have been able to access this policy? And so far, what I've observed, it's not a whole lot of students. So for example, the two case studies for my dissertation research have been Vancouver Island University and University of Saskatchewan, who adopted their policies in, I believe, 2017 and 2018. So relatively recently, right? And definitely in this Truth and Reconciliation calls to action era. And we're seeing there's not a whole ton of students, just a handful of students at both institutions. Yeah. So in terms of total volume of students across the border, we're not seeing a whole lot going in that direction across the border. That said, I've heard from some administrators that they'd like to make the J Treaty a bigger part of their recruitment efforts in what is sometimes called the United States. There's also another, I think, flow of students that is not part of my dissertation research, but I did look at it for a previous project, which is what are there students from what is sometimes called Canada studying in what is sometimes called the United States at the post-secondary level, who are using the J Treaty to work, study, or live in the United States, right? So not necessarily accessing a university policy that's on the books, but presenting their credentials to a border crossing official, making their case, and then being allowed entry into the United States without having to seek out the other kind of paperwork that, say, an international student from Ireland would, for example, right? Students that I've met a handful of students that have been able to go, who've been able to take that pathway into post-secondary. So there's a debordering. Gosh, I don't think we are there yet. I think this is one very small step towards recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and recognizing that Indigenous homelands extend across borders. If anything, COVID in many ways reinforced the border. Stranded people on opposite sides of the border, stranded Indigenous communities across both sides of the border. So I wouldn't say that we are there yet.
Thank you, Michael. You just suggested like 10 minutes ago about the story of these rights, of the respect of this right for students and for indigenous people. I'm curious about the evolution over the past centuries. I wonder if this right to cross the border has been clearly respected by governments. So my question is this one: how has the right to cross the border freely for indigenous members been defended and reinforced for 200 years? But also these rights have also been certainly challenged.
Sure. So I'm happy to weigh in as the researcher settler voice. Cameron, he may have some lived experience as well. So Cameron, feel free to add if you're comfortable and interested. My understanding as a researcher has been that it was sort of informal practice by both governments to allow free passage of indigenous peoples across this border. It was not, and on the U.S. side at least, it wasn't until the 1920s when the U.S. got much more restrictive about immigration, and that's part of a broader wave of nativism in the U.S. Backlash against immigration in the U.S. You have a quota system created in the U.S. in the 1920s. I believe in 1924 was the implementation of a quota system, and if you're going to control the number of people entering the country, borders are going to become much more restrictive. And my understanding is around that time is when indigenous folks, especially Mohawk folks, who have a reservation and territory that spans the border, notably Akwesasne, challenged these restrictions. And it's around this time that you see Paul Daibo, as I mentioned, a Mohawk iron worker, challenge his deportation from Philadelphia through the Jay Treaty. And his case, right, goes all the way to the Supreme Court. U.S. Supreme Court agrees with Paul Daibo. So I want to emphasize that, this recognition of Jay Treaty right is not just a sudden act of good faith from settler governments or institutions. It is constant grinding out indigenous advocacy, right? And so unfortunately, you don't see the same on the Canadian side. In the 1950s, there was a case where the Supreme Court of Canada ruled against an indigenous person who was forced to pay duties on some goods he was carrying across the border. I believe that was the Mitchell case. And then a similar case, no, that was Francis versus the Queen case. And then a similar case in the 2000s, I believe that was a Mitchell case. So the Jay Treaty does not apply in Canada, particularly when it comes to being exempt from paying duties. And as I mentioned, Ben, earlier, in 1952, it enters statute, becomes law through an act of Congress, where this act is codified as part of immigration legislation.
Thank you, Michael. And Cameron, I have the question for you. I have a question for you before your specific section. And what do you think about these institutions of state border? What do you think about this Jay Treaty and the freedom for indigenous people to cross this border? You have some stories to share with us?
Yeah. Well, if you really look at it from outside of the box and from an indigenous perspective, on this land, there was never any borders. There was never any lines drawn or any land owned by any person until the colonization came into effect. There was lines drawn and freedom was restricted. This was, against our beliefs as free people. That we do have a trading system with other tribes. We traded medicines. We traded different even different songs, different stories. We had families from across different borders. There were people that I remember from the 70s and the 80s. They used to come up from down south to come and trade for warmer clothing, and we would trade different stuff and to benefit our lives. not financially. We always looked at life as a trading system. Money was never an object in our lives. It was always just trading products and for people's lives to benefit. And when these lines were drawn on our in our on our earth, on our land, we had to follow rules, and these rules, you have to kind of think, kind of like why and why to follow and why to benefit and why it kind of throws things off track of the mindset of the free person. You know what I mean? It kind of like throws the free person off of the way of life, and it's just it's damaging in the life in the life, and there's a lot of confusion with my people with the Jade Treaty. Some people have just forced to let it go, just to kind of like whatever, but it's there, and the lines are always going to be there, and we have to understand to work with these lines with our people, and to benefit still, and we still have that freedom, and we still have that, but it changes throughout different like when something happens. I guess like say all these people coming to Canada and having to pay for their stuff. It changes because some of these people have dual citizenship across Canada. Like they're citizens in the U.S. and they're citizens in Canada. So I don't know how that changes, but in a way, it probably looks at change of the way they pay things. Like my friend or my dad, he's a healer, and he travels a lot in the Americas, and he gets medicines from all different places, and he brings them over the border. And well, he used to. He's retired now, and he would show me stuff from all around the Americas, different medicines, and he never used to have to pay for these things, and they would trade with his medicines and his knowledge with these other things, and ceremonies. And these ceremonies are they're across America. Um, and what these borders do is they stop these ceremonies and this way of life, and this belief we have, belief system. Even our languages are affected because of these borders drawn. And learning a way to work with these lines that are drawn would benefit, not just my people but everybody. Um, as long as it's looked at as as a as a learning process and a growing process, which it is now, and a healing process most of all. The healing process is the most important of all, because there was a lot of damage done by these lines being drawn on our land. Even still today, uh, um, I wouldn't say our land, I would say this land, because nobody really owns. My people believe nobody can own land. God has put land onto the earth for everybody, and but the king system, or um, their ownership and whatever, it affected my people, and it's still affecting us. And it's time for my people to draw a line and work to heal towards setting things right. And this policy that I've done is a really, it's a, that I've translated. It's really puts things in Indigenous perspective, uh, because Michael has written it in his I would say settler perspective. I had to change it around to make it into a Indigenous perspective. So when like when I talk about the Jade Treaty and all the in English it says there's one paragraph, but in Cree there's like a whole maybe 10 paragraphs to explain why the J Treaty is what it is, and how it affects my people, and how it affects our spiritual life, our family life, and it just shows a different way of understanding the J Treaty, and I think is maybe a little I'm a little bit 200 years a little too late. This should have been done when the J Treaty was, but back in that time we didn't have a written language. I mean, we did, but it was avoided. We weren't considered human beings until 1970 or 1980s, and things are changing, and it's going on the right track. And once we're on the right track, we're going to head towards healing, and we're always going to stay on that track. As long as we stay on that track towards the right thing, we will see changes and benefits in everybody's life, in every settler's life. And I just enjoyed doing this project, and I feel really good about it. And I know that it'll uh, it'll open a lot of doors for a lot of our people, a lot of people, and the right doors. And I'm hoping people will learn the language, learn how to learn that my language and that's being written, it has spirit, it has soul, it has knowledge, it has everything that can be felt um, and understood by the human earth being, the spirit inside us, and that's an important thing because it's part of our healing. And that's about it. That's all I got about the J Treaty and the importance. I think we're on the right track.
Many thanks, Cameron, for sharing all your analysis from the Indigenous perspectives about this J Treaty and the modern and violent borders. Let us now make the link between the rights to cross the border, the cross-border financial aid, and the recognition of the political and legal legitimacy of Indigenous peoples on both sides of the international border. Michael, could you explain how and to what extent these university practices contribute to the consolidation of the sovereignty and rights of Indigenous peoples?
Yeah, so I say it's a start. I remember one of my Indigenous interviewees, participants, said this J Treaty policy is really a hook, right? It's an opening to maybe have bigger conversations about reconciliation, and before reconciliation, there has to be truth. So there's a lot of folks when they're working on this J Treaty policy. I'm speaking about settler people, right? Especially who do self-education, learn about the J Treaty, and it helps them think about and learn about the violent history of colonization. It's also a hook in the sense that providing access to the university in the form of financial aid is just the first step, right? Opening the doors in this, or opening the door a little wider to Indigenous students, is just the first step. So once the policy is there, the next question is, well, are the students being supported? Is the curriculum being decolonized? Are students being included, right? They say, in the diversity, equity, and inclusion literature, being included is being, having access is being invited to the dance, and then being included is being asked to dance. So our students being asked to dance once they are at the university.
Thank you, Michael, for answering all these questions related to your research and about your new report. I would like now to talk about more deeply about the translation into Cree language of this research. And this is our second part of the interview, and the third part, which will follow right after. Cameron, I have a second question related to the question of the translation itself. Could you talk about your work as a Cree translator? What are the challenges? And you just spoke about your father, who is a healer. And finally, could you share about some stories about your personal experience of crossing the borders, you and your people?
Okay. Well, my history of translation is as I was growing up, my grandparents, my great grandparents, they didn't speak English, and they had a lot of doctor's appointments, and I would sit there and translate for them. They would talk about their conditions and what they need and how they felt, and I would tell the doctor, and the doctor. There were times where I would remember my grandmother's conditions, and then I would say, "Well, she's already taking medication for that. Why are you giving her this medication for this?" Stuff like that. I would start to understand the need of translation because it's important, and ever since then, as a child, I knew the importance of translation because the effects of the person that's being translated for, and I started writing. In Cree when I was about 10 or 11. I grew up on a trap line. It's a hunting ground where people collect furs, and I grew up there in the north basin of Lake Winnipeg. Um, I uh, I was raised in Norway House. It's a community about 10 kilometers away from my trap line, and I was back and forth a lot. And I was raised in the traditional aspect, language and culture, and everything that came with it, including the abuse. And it life was good in a way that every person in my is living. I guess I started. A lot of things happened in my life that have just recently changed the way I lived. And I've been healing for 10 years now. I'm recovering alcoholic, and I'm a drug addict. And some things happened in my healing journey that's really put me on track of this language, of my language, and and my history, um, as being pointed out to me. Um, I have a really I don't know. It's a crazy story, a healing journey story, and my story as a translator, I've done the Lord's Prayer in Cree in the 80s. I also did I think it was a commercial. I think it was a drink commercial, and I've done some plays, commercials. I've done all kinds of. I'm a writer. I'm writing a novel right now. Actually, it's called The Forgotten Soldier. It tells about the real history of my people. The history that we're learning about my people is written by the colonizers that came into my land, which is the king. Before the king was the Scottish people that came into my land. And the Robertsons, the McLeods, the Gunn's, and all those people that came, they lived next to my great grandfathers. My great grandfathers are twins, and they lived right there, right next to them. It was called the Jack River Fort. It was placed right there, and they lived there in harmony for 100 years. And in 1830 something, Black Robe arrived. Black Robe there was a movie about Black, and he arrived there, and he colonized my people, and he chased my grandfather away from them. My grandfather, who had the written language, the syllabic language, before it was invented by Mr. Evans, he had the language. It was already there. We already had it, the pre-syllabics, and he was chased away from there, and he started Cross Lake. John Mino became John Miswagon, and the last name Miswagon means wounded spirit or wounded animal, and so that's where the name comes from. And this history is not told because Black Robe's history is above it all. And if you really look outside the box of my history and look at the real history, I would say God's history, or the Creator's history, or whoever's history, the real history, Earth history. You can see my history and my language, and how much healing that we would need to achieve, or to do, in order to get ourselves on the right track with our language, because there's a lot of us that have been taught this history that we don't have a written language, but we do. How could these syllabics have spirits in their words, and how could a person that's from another country come in to invent a language with spirit? It's impossible. Like, I've written the syllabics. I went to a school. It was called Jack River School, and it was a Catholic school. It was a day school, and in that school, I wasn't able to talk Cree. I wasn't able. I was strapped for talking Cree. I was strapped for just being me. I was, it was sisters would come and strap me. There was always something going on. It was it was abuse. It was because of who I was. I couldn't talk Cree. I couldn't. It was just, I had to talk English. And I remember sitting in class, and I'd had to do these syllables, and I'd be sitting and saying these words, these English words in syllables. But in my mind, I would be remembering the syllabics, and it would be getting, because when I was being raised, my grandparents, my great grandparents would introduce me. They would tell me about syllabics, and we would talk about our language, and they would tell me the truth. But when I go to day school, the nuns would tell me about the English language, and I'm like, I didn't really know, how to adjust. And but still today, there are people a little older than me back home that know how to write in syllabics, that never attended Jack River School, and they know how to write syllabics, but they don't remember how they know. They just know. And these people are amazing. And with this truth of this language, of our languages, we can heal, knowing knowing the truth, and we can work together and build upon this truth and heal from it, because we do have a written language, and it was always written. And like in the document the policy we just did, there are words in there that are like 30 letters long. Okay. um, when you look at these letters in syllabics, in the syllabic letters, you look at them, a Cree reader can pick them up like a barcode into their spirit. They can pick it up just by looking at the syllabics and feel the words, what's being said on that topic. This is the way we did our songs, our poetry, our stories. There are long words, and you could take whatever you want from those words. And it's I forget the name of the style of writing, but they're words that are joined together to make certain words, longer words, and they're all put together. There's like maybe 10 words in one sentence, and 10 words in one main Cree word. And in that word, you can go back to that one word and then go back and use that one word and go back again. And that way you're prolonging the story. You're putting it into your spirit, if you understand the meaning. Um, the spirit, the mind, the body, and the soul of a Cree person is one thing. And this is taken away by the colonizers' belief. We well, I call it the Aya, AYA, and it's your eternal being. It's your face. It's your body. It's your mind. It's your feeling. It's your hands. Everything. It's our whole being touched with your Aya, and it's your knowledge. It's everything. And with this Aya, when you build and heal with it, and become this earth being, you can understand life better. It opens the picture of it a lot more, because you're looking at it from an earthly perspective. And this is important in our healing and our language structure, our songs and our poetry and our everyday lives. We should learn how to heal with our language, and how to spread the beliefs of yeah, we are people. We are a true human being. We are earth people with a written language, and because of what the colonizers say, that it was never a written language, it's because of the lines drawn on our land. So we all have to kind of work with these imaginary lines and these imaginary beliefs, and look at the truth. Because without, like Michael said, we can't have reconciliation without the truth. And we need to see the truth on everything before we start to heal. And I am looking forward to doing more projects. I work in a way where I work outside the box. I am not affiliated with any organizations. I don't like working for hours, or I usually just call myself uncolonized thinker. Like I'm still in the trap line. I'm still in the bush. My mind is still back there, and that's where I'm going to be all my life, for the rest of my life. I don't want to. I don't know. Unless they owe me $1 million and want me a professor somewhere, which will never happen. But yeah.
Any money for that, Ben? Do you have $1 million?
Maybe we could find it.
Yeah.
Wow!
But yeah,
thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Cameron, for sharing your deep thinking, your deep analysis, and deep concerns, and the importance, the very big importance of the language, and this also the challenges, how to translate an English text to a Cree text. And thank you for sharing all these beautiful and strong and deep insights with us today.
Okay.
And in relation of this work of translation into your Cree language, and in relation to the whole context of resistance, resilience, and consolidation of the cultures and sovereignty of indigenous peoples, Cameron, what are you most proud of?
The most thing I'm proud of is completing everything that I've done. I'm proud of doing what I'm doing, and completing it, and making sure that it looks right and understandable. I don't want to be putting stuff. I don't want to be putting lies out there. I don't want to. I love doing plays. I love translating to people that are artistic and open-minded. And I'm just proud of the journey I'm on with the language, and the growing that I'm still doing. I'm still learning, and I'm learning my history and my language's history, and I'm telling stories, traditional and modern stories um, with language. And I've just completed a 60 chapter, 900-page novel that teaches you Cree while you're reading it.
Wow.
It's an interactive novel called The Forgotten Soldier, and it tells about the real history of our people, of my people, and and language, and where and how we used to live. There's stories about there's traditional stories in the novel. There's poetry in there. There's prayers, all in my language, all in the Cree language, and and it's it was interesting. I still have to have it published. I'm still working on it, so from time to time, but it's done, and I'm not, like I said, I'm still living in the bush, and it'll go whenever it comes. It'll go whenever it comes to light. It'll go on its own. I'm not forcing it. I'm not looking to get rich. I don't really care about. Well, I care about money a little bit, but not as much. Um, not as much as I used to. Since my healing journey has begun, I put my money thinking aside, and as long as I'm comfortable and happy, and healing, and my family's the same way, I'm good. And this is what we need back into our people's lives, is to have that concept of language and connection to the earth, and satisfaction and humility. And once I'm on this track with the language, and I'm starting to talk to people that in that sense, I think that's probably what I'm most proud of, is talking to people in this healing sense of my language. And what I really want to do is talk to the people that are, well, I've been doing it. There's people that are living in bush shacks here in Winnipeg, my people. And, they live in there in a -40 weather. And it's a glass building, glass bush shacks, and they're living in them. And so I go in there and I talk with them. I talk Cree with them. I open their minds in Cree. They tell me their feelings in Cree. They cry to me in Cree. And I pray with them. I don't pray for them, I pray with them. And I make them feel they're still loved and they still belong. And, they're put there by these lands that are drawn on this map, these lines that are drawn on this map. And we all still have to heal from the abuse of um, whatever abuse that came with us, with these lines. And once we're on that track of healing with the languages and the songs and whatever that comes to our traditional way of life, that comes with our traditional way of lives, we do it the right way, and we'll all be proud. We'll all be proud, and we'll all be healed, with nature and with God. And another thing I wanted to mention is Manitoba. The name Manitoba. It comes from my great grandfathers. There's a stone back home. It's a big, huge stone. It's in the middle of a marsh. It's really hard to get to, and this stone is cracked in 4 directions.
Wow.
And within the middle of the stone is a ceremonial place where my grandfathers used to hold their ceremony. And the name Manitoba comes from the stone. It means Manitou Upawamowin, where you dream, where God lets you dream, the place where God lets you dream. Manitoba comes from there.
Wow.
And that's because of the Scottish people that built the fort, the Jack River Fort, next to my grandparents, my great grandfathers. That's where the name comes from. The true history of our people, of my people. And once we look at this true history and start to heal from this knowledge of abuse and the true history and whatever knowledge that comes out from it, and we look at the ball, we hold it in our hands, we can examine it, and we can know what to do with it. Right now we're healing from a history that we don't understand. We don't really, why did it happen, or who, or what, where. What am I hurting from? And you have to look at it as truthfully as possible. And, and that's what I'm proud of, is just the road I'm on, and to where I'm going, and what I see ahead. It's brighter, a brighter view ahead. And thanks to Michael and you, Ben, you're making it a lot brighter. You're putting the light on my path with this policy, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Cameron. And
Yeah.
You just made the link with the last part of our interview. I wanted to know a little bit more about how your cooperation in this work went. I'm curious about the little story behind the project. How did you two start working together?
Sure. So I'd be happy to jump in there. So Cameron talked about, connections and putting his work out into the universe. So we came together in an interesting way. Maybe it was fated, I don't know. But during my time in Victoria for the first half of my cross-border fellowship, which I've really enjoyed and learned a lot from, I took and you'll laugh, I took a haunted walking ghost tour of Victoria, where they led us through all the spooky places of Victoria, all the ghost stories and such. And afterwards, I caught up with one of the other members in the group. Her name was McPhee, her last name. So Ms. McPhee, she was on the tour, and we got to talking. And it turns out she was in town as part of a play that she was in called Frozen River. It was a play about truth and reconciliation. I see Cameron nodding his head there. We got to talking. She said that she was OG Cree and that the play had been translated into Cree. And then a light bulb went off. And I thought, gosh, why am I not translating my dissertation or my brief into one of the hundreds or thousands of Indigenous languages, right? It's a little sort of a contradiction that I'm writing only in English about, a story that's really about colonization. I need to do the minimum, translate it into at least one Indigenous language. Cree seemed like a good candidate given how many speakers there are on Turtle Island, and given that the University of Saskatchewan is located on land that includes the homelands of the Cree. So Ms. McPhee didn't have a contact for Cameron, but she did have his LinkedIn. So I sent Cameron a message to his LinkedIn, and I waited and hoped, and then maybe Cameron can fill in the rest in the next bit of the story about what happened next.
Well, I don't really go on my LinkedIn account as much as I used to. I was busy doing another project, and I needed to open more doors, I guess. So I went into the linked account. I seen briefly a message, and then I got an email. I think I called you, or you called. You left a number, and I called you. I called Michael, and we took it from there. And I was very happy that one of the actors put my work out there, and I was pleased with her, and it's and I took the job right away. I took the request. I thought, okay, well, yeah, I'll do it. And I read most of it. I've gotten work that looks impossible to do, to translate in Cree. I've gotten work like that, and I've translated it. I've done it. I've as much as I could, and so this policy looked pretty challenging, but it was doable, and with the right spirit and the right perspective, I did it, and I did it with pride. Um, I put some spirit in it, um, some some words that are hard to say in Cree, um, but I've done it in a set and structure, and I'm hoping maybe in these sentence structures, these long words, there could be songs or understanding of the language more written with them in that style, and it was interesting. I learned a little more about the J Treaty and how the current issues of the J Treaty now is, and like in that, I think it was the '90s and the early 2000s. I kind of first heard my dad talked about the J Treaty and how he brings his medicine in to others, and I understood it, but I didn't really. I knew we had some sort of right, but I didn't know how much. And this kind of opened my eyes, and I would say opened my Cree eyes, and made me understand that our people need to understand a little more. And I enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to doing more projects like this. And that's about it, I guess. Yeah, that's about it. My mind just went blank.
Thank you, Cameron. And Michael, what is your most proud of having worked with Cameron in this translation? What could you share with us, Michael?
Wow, there's a lot in that question. Well, first off, there's the personal element. I really enjoyed working with Cameron. Translation is very personal, right? Especially if it's coming from someone like Cameron, and given that this translation is also an act of resistance and language revitalization, so it's a real honor to be part of this process. It's been fun getting to know Cameron, right? We will text back and forth, checking on a word, and for me, it's been educational as a settler, learning about Cree and Cree language and culture. It's a funny coincidence. I was up in Saskatoon visiting a friend, where we visited a local museum where all the signs were in Cree syllabics. So I texted Cameron and I learned a bit more about the different dialects of Cree. And then I think on a sort of metaphorical level, our relationship, I see it in terms of the framework that I use for my dissertation, which is a polishing the chain relationship. And that's a metaphor and image that goes back to the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois and the first Dutch settlers. And when the Haudenosaunee first noticed the Dutch on their land, over time they came to an agreement with the Dutch that the Haudenosaunee would allow the Dutch to be on the land. Is my understanding, or has been told to me, as long as the Dutch didn't interfere, right, with the Haudenosaunee way of life. And that was captured through an image of two vessels going down a river of life, not interfering. There was a Haudenosaunee canoe and a Dutch ship. And connecting those two vessels was first a rope and then a chain. And that chain was silver, so it wouldn't rust. However, silver can tarnish, right? And the tarnishing is a metaphor for a relationship that's gone south, right? Or a relationship that needs some attention. And like all relationships, people to people, especially Indigenous settler on Turtle Island, there needs to be a revisiting, a revitalization of those earlier promises, right? Especially particularly on the settler side. this agreement of non-interference. So to bring it full circle, I see this as sort of a polishing of the chain, and that Cameron and I are in relationship. Relationships aren't always easy. There's going to be challenges, right? But we're going to keep working at it. And, in this very small way, right? We can't speak for all Indigenous people or all settler people. Maybe we're doing, a sort of miniature act of polishing the chain. As hopefully one day we achieve these goals of truth and reconciliation. That's kind of how I visualize it metaphorically.
Thank you, Michael. Last question for both of you in a short answer. In one word, what could you share a word for the next students? What could you share with us? Like an advice or a good word? Cameron, what do you think after Michael?
I would probably think if you're all in one word, it's hard to put. I can say it in Cree, but it's like 10 words and it's just honesty and truth and just all looking at something in a magnifying glass and seeing a clearer perspective, a more broader, honest, real perspective, viewpoint, I guess. And that's about it, a more clearer picture. You know what I mean? It's more, I don't know what the word would be. A clearer picture ahead, I guess. I think Boyasponagan, it means the road ahead the road ahead looks straight. And when you do that, with honesty, it'll always remain straight with an honest perspective. And that's just the only word I can say.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Cameron. Thank you very much. And your word, Michael, for the next students or for the current students?
Wow. Well, if you could indulge me, I'll give a few words, which is I would encourage all students, Indigenous and settler alike, to think about study opportunities that might be on the other side of a border or other borders. My story in relation to this topic began when I had the opportunity to study in Montreal through a Fulbright fellowship, and it was through that I became aware and learned about a history that was really missing from my education so far. And so if you are thinking about studying, or even a 1-year fellowship like I did, it can be really, really transformational. So think about, of course, what makes sense for you, for your family, for your community, for your career. But if it makes sense, I can't overstate how transformational studying somewhere else can be. And if you are Indigenous and these J Treaty policies make sense for you, please check them out. For example, University of Victoria, where Ben is calling us from, they have a J Treaty policy. So you would not be charged international student fees if you were coming from this side of the border. And perhaps University of Victoria's amazing programs in Indigenous governance or law might be of interest, right? So that might be a reason or something to think about studying on the other side of the U.S.-Canada border, at least.
Thank you, Michael. Many thanks to both of you. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much, Cameron, for participating in our podcast series. It was a great and deep discussion on cross-border rights, Indigenous languages, Cree language, and Cree culture. And we don't have to forget, Canada is also an Indigenous-based name. And the Michael's report is available on the BIG website. So thank you, both of you. It was a great interview. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thanks, Cameron.
You're welcome.
This was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Thank you, Cameron. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for all your attention, and see you soon for the next issue. Bye-bye.
Bye.